How many different Bible canons have existed down through history? The answer may surprise you. Let's first look at what books people viewed as scripture in the first few centuries before and after Jesus, and then move forward in time. In the New Testament, we see two interesting groups mentioned. The Samaritans had their own version of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, at the beginning and heart of the Hebrew Bible. Interestingly, they did not accept any of the other books of the Hebrew Bible. Another group, called the Sadducees, were influential in Jerusalem by the time of Jesus, and it's possible that they only accepted the Torah and no other books. They certainly rejected the rabbinic traditions of the Pharisees. The Sadducees were also interesting because they were largely in charge of Yahweh's temple at Jerusalem. So there were at least some groups by the time of Jesus that had quite a restrictive view of the canon to only 5 books. And by the way, I should point out that many modern scholars argue that it doesn't make any sense to speak of a canon yet during this period, but many agree that there was definitely a canon consciousness, even centuries before this, so I won't go into that debate here. So some groups, like the Samaritans and many Sadducees, had a fairly restrictive view of what books they considered authoritative. But what about other groups during these early centuries? Well, some had a much broader view of what texts were holy. From around 300 to 100 BC, most of the Deuterocanon was written, mostly in Greek. Enough people would hold these books sacred enough that they would at some point during that period be included with a Greek translation of the Bible, which also began to emerge in the 3rd century BC. Now this is where the history of the Bible gets interesting. I have read so many books on the origins of the Bible, written by both believing and secular scholars, that make the blanket statement or simply imply that the Deuterocanonical books were never included in the Bible until the Christians added them around the 2nd or 3rd century after Christ. This is simply a modern misconception. These books were written by Jews before Christianity came along, and they were included along with the Greek translation of the other books of the Bible, which we know was used by many Jews by the time of Christ, even if some Jews did not accept its quote-unquote extra books. But before we go any further, we first need to say a few important things about this Greek translation, because it was the primary Bible used by the authors of the New Testament. Whether they accept any Deuterocanonical books is something we'll come back to in a later lesson. One of the major tipping points in history that made the West what it is today was when Alexander the Great Hellenized the Mediterranean world. Hellenization just means that he brought Greek culture to the rest of that world. The next big tipping point was when Christianity made its first big leap toward influencing the world, arguably around the time that Roman Emperor Constantine became the first ruler to promote Christianity rather than persecute it. These two events were critical for shaping what our world is today, but there was something else that compounded the effect of both of these events, and that was the Greek translation of the Bible. In the 3rd century before Christ, only a few decades after Alexander the Great Hellenized the Mediterranean world, this Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures began. Most scholars think that the Torah was translated first, with the rest of the Hebrew Bible being fully translated by the 2nd or 1st century BC. The importance of this translation cannot be overstated. It was the beginning of the Bible's massive influence over the nations, who at this time were using Greek as the global language of trade and learning, just as English is today. In fact, Greek would continue to be the global language long after the rise of the Roman Empire. By the time that Constantine would commission copies of the Bible in the Roman Empire of the 4th century after Christ, they were still using this Greek translation. This Greek Bible is called the Septuagint, from the Greek word for 70, from the number of Jewish sages who were said to have worked on the initial phase of the project, the translation of the Torah. Another reason the Septuagint is extremely important is that it was used by the New Testament writers extensively. Some scholars estimate that more than half of all New Testament quotes of the Old Testament are from the Septuagint version. And sometimes the Septuagint has differences from the Hebrew, even sometimes theologically significant differences that the New Testament writers relied on. I go into this in detail in my book, but for now I just want to make a couple of very important points. 1. The Greek Septuagint was one of the most important tools Christianity had and used to influence and eventually conquer the Greek-speaking world. And 2, it was the Septuagint that was not only used by the New Testament writers, but also the vast majority of Christians, at least until the 4th century, after which it would still influence Christianity, as we'll see, even down to the present day. It also remains, to this day, the Bible used by the Orthodox in the East. And before you think this sounds weird, remember that it was the Bible used by the New Testament authors themselves. Many early Christians even took seriously the idea that God had inspired the translation and that it was therefore divine, even when it differed from the Hebrew Bible. So what books were included in the Septuagint by the time of Christ? Answering this question is problematic for several reasons. First, there was no complete bound volumes of the Bible when the Septuagint was produced, much less one that still exists. So knowing what books were included is not simply a matter of examining a single bound copy. Sacred texts were actually libraries. The Bible was not a single book that you held in your hand, but a collection of separate scrolls. Secondly, ancient ideas of sacred texts were quite different from ours. For instance, the modern view of canon typically includes the idea that it was somehow closed at some point in the distant past, that it can no longer be added to. Most of the ancients had quite a different concept of revelation. For instance, Luke begins his gospel with multiple prophets and prophetic revelation. God was still speaking for many first-century Jews, and some of those words were written down for later generations. Thirdly, the various books of the Septuagint were not a single or even a multi-edition text like we tend to think of texts. Each book would have been hand-copied, so as a result, there were actually variations between copies, especially so among regions. And the translations of the various books were made by different groups of translators in different time periods. By the time of Christ, there were even other Greek revisions of the Septuagint, but we won't get into those here. So what books were included in the Septuagint around the time of the birth of Christ? The answer is that it's hard to nail down exactly. Also, it would have probably depended on which group you ask. However, what we can know is that many people of this period believed several books of the Deuterocanon to be sacred texts. We have evidence for this in the fact that ancient libraries, such as the one at Qumran, included many deuterocanonical books along with biblical texts, as well as many other writings that they considered sacred. We also have several ancient writers who referenced deuterocanonical texts as authoritative, which I'll come back to in a moment. Of course, there are also other writers from around this time who seem to suggest that the canon was closed and did not leave room for the Deuterocanon in their book lists. These include the first-century Jewish writers Josephus and Philo. Josephus even goes so far as to mention some latter books that had been written, yet were not given the same authority by their forefathers. But as I said, ancient views of sacred texts were even more nuanced than modern ones, and even modern views of biblical text often treat them differently. Just ask most Christians if there is a difference between the Old and New Testaments. Also interesting is that in early and later Christian debates of what books were canonical, the view of that term often was what was permitted to be read in the assembly, with little being said about what books actually came from God. I believe there are multiple reasons for this, but I'll save that for later lessons. Let's go back to our earliest records that seem, at least to modern eyes, to suggest a closed canon. Even though Josephus emphasizes that the books of the Bible were fixed and unalterable since the rule of Artaxerxes, he would often recognize other texts as authoritative, while speaking of, quote, the law and the allied documents, end quote. And regarding the books written since Artaxerxes, mentioned earlier, he says that the reason they were not esteemed the same is that they lacked, quote, an exact succession of prophets since that time, end quote. I would argue that he is not necessarily saying that these books were devoid of authority. On the contrary, when he gives his history, he claims to only be conveying what's found in the Bible. Yet he includes many details only found in those extra-biblical books. Josephus also believed in prophets in his own day, and even claimed that he himself received revelation from God. In other words, even though Josephus esteemed the books of the Hebrew canon with a special canonical status, he had no problem believing that God's revelation could still come through prophets of his own day, including in their writings. I also mentioned Philo, who is often quoted as evidence that at least some first-century Jews believed that the Hebrew Bible was closed before his own time. His testimony would also seem to suggest that the deuterocanonical books were excluded. Although Philo uses the tripartite designation for the Jewish Bible, which I cover in my book, he adds to that list of texts, quote, all kinds of other things by reason of which knowledge and piety are increased and brought to perfection, end quote. He no doubt held the books of the Hebrew Bible in highest esteem, yet that does not necessarily mean that he would not have held other texts as holy in some sense. And like Josephus, Philo too believed that he received some sort of inspiration from God for his own writings. Apart from Josephus and Philo, one of the best examples of how some ancient Jews could have seen the Hebrew Bible as the accepted canon, yet viewed other books as holy in some sense, is right there in the Deuterocanon itself. For instance, in 2 Esdras 14, the author tells the story of how Ezra received the writings similar to the account of how Moses did. He is given the 24 books to make fresh copies of, which is ostensibly the Hebrew Bible, plus 70 more secret books, which are only for the wise. Even more interesting is that the author may have even seen these additional 70 books as better than the original 24. At the very least, he certainly viewed them as also being inspired. The Book of Jubilees also sees the Hebrew Bible as important, and yet the Book of Jubilees itself seems to aspire to be some sort of holy book. And the author was not alone in that opinion. And one of the best proofs of this is that Jubilees was accepted by enough believers for it to be added to some Bibles and remains in print to this day. Just because the ancients had different classifications for their holy books does not mean that they were not all still viewed as holy, at least by some groups. In fact, I would argue that the word Deuterocanon, which again means second law, would have certainly been an appropriate term to many ancients who used these texts. Many indeed saw them as a second law and as a legitimate expansion on the first. In fact, such a division was already present in the Hebrew Bible itself, as the Torah, the heart of the Bible, was certainly afforded a special authoritative status, though the latter prophets were viewed as no less inspired. The latter prophets themselves showed special deference to the Torah. This distinction between the Torah and the rest of the Hebrew Bible is seen every time you see an expression like the law and the prophets. The letter of Aristeas is our earliest account of the creation of the Septuagint, and it tells us that the Torah was translated first. This is yet another indication that the Torah held a special place in the hearts of Jews, even if they viewed the other prophets of the Hebrew Bible as just as inspired. And don't even Protestant Christians do something similar? Do they not view the 27 books of the New Testament as a legitimate, very much inspired expansion and revealing of the Hebrew Bible? In fact, we see the patristic fathers very much favoring certain books of the Hebrew Bible when they quote or allude to it. They rarely cite such books as the histories, for example. We have no reason, however, to conclude that they did not view them as inspired as well. Likewise, when they only cited the Deuterocanon a little, we should not assume that they did not view some of those books as holy in some sense. Classifying holy books into different groups, even calling some secondary in some sense, has never been a barrier to considering them inspired or holy in some way, both for Jews and Christians. What other evidence do we have for when various people groups did or did not believe in the Deuterocanon? Well, we know of ancient Aramaic translations of the Hebrew Bible, which is the language that the Jews came to speak after the Persian captivity. These go back to around the 3rd century BC, and the Deuterocanon was not included in them. Some books authored by Protestants on the Deuterocanon will argue that the earliest Christian writers did not cite deuterocanonical text. This is not exactly true. It does in fact appear that early Christian writers relied very little on the Deuterocanon, but they did in fact sometimes cite them. For instance, we have Irenaeus and Tertullian citing wisdom in the 2nd century. Even earlier than that, 1 Clement quotes it around the end of the 1st century. Later, we'll come back to the question of whether the New Testament itself cites wisdom as authoritative. One of our earliest canon lists also includes wisdom, which we'll come back to in a moment. Origen, who wrote during the first half of the 3rd century, has a view of the Deuterocanon that is arguably nuanced. Though he clearly did not afford such books the same authority as the Hebrew Bible, he did include some of them in his massive 6-column translation of the Bible, called the Hexapla. He included Wisdom, Judith, and Sirach. Also, as we highlight a few details across the vast history of the Bible, note that we are not always just discussing the 7, quote, extra books of the modern Catholic Bible. There are several more books that initially were included in ancient Bibles, as we'll see, and some of them are still used in the Orthodox East and in Africa. Some of these books are classified by scholars as pseudepigrapha rather than Deuterocanon, but such nuances make no difference for our present study. I'll simply continue to use the term Deuterocanon for any books that were considered holy by these various groups, but are not found in the modern Protestant Bible. But let's go back to our timeline. In the 3rd century BC, it is well agreed among historians that Egypt is ground zero for the birth of the Septuagint's Torah at least, which are often called the 5 books of Moses or the Pentateuch. Egypt had quite a sizable Jewish population, and the city of Alexandria in particular was quite the hub of culture and philosophical thought, quite influential in the world of ideas, with the best libraries, scientists, and universities. Alexandria was so influential that the 2 current top-ranking history books on Alexandria on Amazon are subtitled Birthplace of the Modern World and The City That Changed the World. There is a great deal of truth in these subtitles. The author of The Rise and Fall of Alexandria even argues that Alexandria was more important as an influencer of the modern world than Athens or Rome. And one of the greatest influences Alexandria gave to the modern world was the Greek Bible that would become the primary Bible of Christianity. Some authors, even believing Christians, have gone so far as to claim that Christianity would have never even existed but for the Greek translation of the Bible that was born in Alexandria. Regardless, it's hard to find a more influential event in human history than the first translation of the Bible into a truly global language, which still affects our culture and politics to the present day. But what about after the initial translation of the Torah? What about the rest of the books of the Hebrew Bible, which were translated into Greek by around the 2nd century before Christ? Were they also translated first in Egypt? And what about the Deuterocanon, which was written over the same time period? There is much that historians would love to know, but for which we have very sparse evidence. Over the last couple of centuries, there have been two main competing schools of thought regarding the origin of the Deuterocanon. The first is that these books originated in Egypt, just like the rest of the Greek Hebrew Bible. This was the majority view until the 20th century, when Albert Sundberg popularized the current mostly dominant view that the Deuterocanon actually originated among Jews in Palestine itself. Another scholar, Jan Justin, has more recently tried to revive the older view that Egypt was the birthplace of the Deuterocanon, and he offers fairly compelling arguments. But no matter where the Deuterocanon was first written, we can be sure of one thing. By the time Christ came along, the Deuterocanon was both well-known and revered by many Jews across the Greek-speaking world, in Alexandria, Palestine, and possibly in other major cultural centers of influence like Antioch and those of Asia Minor, which figured prominently in the New Testament account of the spread of that new sect of the Nazarenes in the 1st century. Maybe most telling is that we know some Palestinian Jews, many of whom knew and revered the Hebrew version of the Scriptures, also greatly respected the Greek Deuterocanonical books. The scrolls of Qumran, aka the Dead Sea Scrolls, are testament to such a view of Scripture in Palestine. That group was destroyed in the 60s, so their views of Scripture certainly preceded that of the Christians. Although we unfortunately can't go back to the 1st century and conduct a poll of Jewish beliefs about what books were holy, we do know that the Deuterocanon was quite popular, even if there is no way to know if this was a majority view or not. And we also know that when Christians came along, they did not add the Deuterocanon to the Hebrew canon. They in fact adopted an existing canon which would quickly become the majority canon, if it wasn't already. Though the Pharisaic Judaism that would survive the destruction of the temple in AD 70 did not appear to use most of the Deuterocanon, the other Jewish sect that survived the destruction, that is, Christians, would in fact use it, and they quickly became the majority. In the next lesson, we'll see the manuscript evidence for the inclusion of the Deuterocanon in the earliest Bibles, and how different views of what books belonged in the Bible would even persist well into the 18th century.